I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso. Today I speak not as a commander, not as a strategist, nor as a man of power, but as a son, a person of faith, and a human being who has wrestled with God in silence. What I am about to share is not a political message. It is not a campaign. It is not an argument against anyone's faith. It is simply my truth. I was born into a traditional Muslim family. Islam was not only our religion, it was our identity, our honor, and our moral compass. Prayer shaped the rhythm of each day. Respect for elders guided our behavior. As the eldest son, I carried responsibility early, not only for myself, but for the honor of my entire family. Faith was something you inherited, had to protect, and never publicly questioned. Yet even in obedience, I felt an emptiness I could not name. I prayed faithfully, but at times God seemed distant. When suffering surrounded me, when injustice repeated itself in our villages and across the continent, I quietly asked questions I did not dare speak aloud. Why does suffering persist among the faithful? What does justice truly mean? Is obedience enough if the heart remains restless? At university, the world opened up. I met people of many different beliefs and many doubts. I listened more than I spoke. Some conversations unsettled me. Others awakened in me a curiosity I tried to suppress. It was there, unexpectedly, that I heard the story of Jesus in a way I had never heard before. Not as a figure of doctrine, but as love made flesh. A man who touched the wounded, forgave his enemies, and suffered alongside humanity, rather than standing above it. I resisted. At first I read the gospel to challenge it, then quietly to understand it. What I found both disturbed and comforted me. Grace, forgiveness, unconditional love. Slowly, painfully, something within me changed. After long nights of prayer and fear, I surrendered. Not to an ideology, but to a person. I chose to follow Jesus, and with that choice came my greatest terror, telling my family. This story is not about abandoning one people for another. It is about the cost of honesty, the fragility of family bonds, and the long road toward reconciliation. It is about faith tested not by strangers, but by those we love most. What do you think about this journey? Should a leader speak openly about such inner struggles, or remain silent? I will tell you everything that followed, step by step, in what comes next. I want to return to the beginning, before doubt, before fear, before choice. I want to return to my childhood. I was born into a Muslim household where faith was not explained because it did not need to be. It was lived, it was breathed, it was assumed the way the sun rises and sets. My earliest memories are shaped by the rhythm of prayer, by the quiet seriousness with which my parents approached God, and by the sense that faith was the spine holding our family upright. My father prayed with discipline and restraint. My mother prayed with tears and tenderness. Between them, I learned that belief was not only about words spoken toward heaven, but about behavior toward people. Respect for elders was absolute. Hospitality was sacred. Honor was not personal, it was collective. What I did reflected not only on me, but on generations before me. Islam, in our home, was identity. It was heritage. It was dignity. To question it felt unthinkable. Not because questions were forbidden, but because they felt like betrayal. As the eldest son, I understood early that I carried more than my own future. I carried expectations, I carried continuity, I carried the unspoken hope that I would preserve what had been entrusted to me. I loved my family deeply, I still do, and because of that love, I tried to become the son they needed me to be. I memorized prayers, I fasted, I obeyed. Outwardly, I was faithful and proud. Inwardly, I believed this was what righteousness looked like. Looking back now, I do not speak of that time with regret or disdain. I speak of it with gratitude. My childhood faith gave me discipline. It gave me moral seriousness. It taught me that God is not an accessory to life, but its center. Those foundations did not disappear later. They followed me, even when my path changed. But even in that structured devotion, something was forming quietly inside me. A sensitivity to suffering, a restlessness when answers felt complete too quickly. A longing not just to obey God, but to know Him. At the time, I did not recognize these feelings as the beginning of a journey. I thought they were weaknesses to be corrected. So I buried them under duty and silence. I did not know then that God often begins His work not with rebellion, but with unease. This was the soil in which everything else grew. As I grew older, the questions I had buried did not disappear. They matured quietly, like seeds beneath dry soil. On the surface, my life looked orderly and faithful. Inside, something was unsettled. I prayed as I had been taught. I followed the rhythms of devotion. Yet there were moments, especially in solitude, when God felt far away. Not absent, but distant. I would complete my prayers and still feel unheard. This troubled me deeply, because I did not doubt God's existence. I doubted my closeness to Him. Around me, suffering was not theoretical. I saw poverty that prayer alone did not lift. I saw violence justified with sacred language. I saw good people endure hardship without explanation. These realities did not make me angry at God, but they made me wonder about meaning. What was righteousness for, if the righteous still bled? What was obedience worth, if it did not heal the broken? These were not questions I shared at the dinner table. In my family, faith was a refuge, not a battlefield. To voice doubt felt like placing a burden on those I loved. I was afraid of hurting my parents, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of appearing ungrateful for the spiritual inheritance I had received. So I learned to live with two voices inside me. One spoke the language of certainty, the other whispered uncertainty late at night. I told myself this tension was temporary, that maturity would silence the questions. Instead, maturity sharpened them. I remember sitting alone after prayer, asking God not for answers but for honesty. I did not want easy reassurance. I wanted truth, even if it was uncomfortable. Yet I also feared where such honesty might lead. In my heart, I sensed that once certain doors are opened, they do not close again. This inner conflict taught me empathy. It taught me that many believers, across religions, carry silent struggles they never confess. It also taught me humility. A man who has never questioned believes too easily that he understands God fully. At the time, I did not interpret my questions as faith deepening. I interpreted them as a personal failure. I tried harder, I became stricter. I hoped discipline would calm the unease. It did not. What I know now is this: questions are not the enemy of faith. Silence is. And God, in His patience, allowed my questions to remain unanswered, not to punish me, but to prepare me. The ground was being loosened. I simply did not know it yet. University changed the pace of my life. Not because it pulled me away from faith, but because it placed me among people who carried their faith or their doubt differently. For the first time, I shared classrooms with men and women who spoke openly about belief as a journey rather than an inheritance. Some were devout, some were wounded by religion, some believed fiercely, others believed nothing at all. What struck me was not their conclusions, but their honesty. They asked questions without fear of disgrace. I listened more than I spoke. I was careful. I carried my upbringing with pride, and I did not wish to betray it. Yet exposure itself changes a person. Ideas do not need permission to enter the mind. They arrive through stories, through friendships, through late conversations that linger longer than planned. I met people who had suffered greatly and yet spoke of God with tenderness rather than bitterness. I met others who had lost faith entirely and still lived with integrity and compassion. This disturbed my simple categories. I had believed belief guaranteed virtue and disbelief guaranteed emptiness. Reality was more complex. In this environment, faith stopped being abstract. It became personal. I was no longer defending a tradition. I was observing lives, and some of those lives carried a quiet peace I could not explain. It was during this time that I first heard about Jesus in a way that unsettled me. Not as a distant prophet acknowledged respectfully, but as a presence spoken of with intimacy. People spoke of him as if he walked with them through their failures, not above them in judgment. My instinct was resistance. I told myself I was merely studying, merely listening. But curiosity had already taken root. I felt challenged, not attacked, invited, not pressured, and that distinction mattered. At night, alone in my room, I wondered why these stories troubled me so deeply. I was not seeking a new faith. I was trying to understand why my heart reacted before my mind could organize a defense. The university did not give me answers. It gave me exposure. And exposure is dangerous, not because it destroys faith, but because it forces faith to grow or retreat. Mine was being tested. It was not a sermon that changed me. It was a story. Someone spoke of Jesus not as a figure enclosed in doctrine, but as a man who entered human pain without armor. They spoke of him touching those society avoided, forgiving those who did not deserve forgiveness, and refusing power even when it was offered to him. This was not the language of conquest or fear. It was the language of surrender. At first, I listened with suspicion. I had been taught respect, but also distance. Jesus, in my understanding, was a prophet to be honored, not a life to be entered. Yet what I heard that day did not feel like theology. It felt like an invitation into suffering transformed by love. What unsettled me most was not what was said about Jesus, but what was absent. There was no triumphalism, no claim of superiority, no attempt to erase my past. Only a quiet insistence that God had chosen closeness over control. I told myself this was emotional manipulation. I told myself I was immune. but something within me recognized a voice I had been waiting for without knowing its name. Later, alone, I tried to dismiss the experience. I reminded myself of who I was, where I came from, what I represented, yet the image of Jesus remained with me, not as an argument but as a presence that refused to be ignored. I began to ask myself a dangerous question. What if God is not only to be obeyed but to be encountered? What if holiness looks like compassion before it looks like discipline? What if strength is revealed through sacrifice? These thoughts frightened me. They threatened the structure that had held my life together. I did not rush toward them. I retreated. I became defensive. I told myself I was merely curious, nothing more. But curiosity, once awakened, does not obey commands. That night, for the first time, I wondered whether my questions were not leading me away from God but closer to His heart. I did not ask for a Bible. I did not announce my interest. I found the gospel quietly, almost accidentally, as one finds something they are not yet ready to admit they are looking for. At first, I read with a closed heart. I read to analyze, to compare, to protect myself. I told myself that understanding another text did not threaten my faith. I approached the words the way one approaches a debate, alert and guarded. But the gospel does not behave like a debate. It behaves like a mirror. I read at night, in secrecy. I hid the book the way one hides a letter that could change a life. I told no one. Silence felt safer than explanation. Each page unsettled me, not because it attacked what I believed, but because it spoke to what I feared. Jesus did not speak like a philosopher constructing arguments. He spoke like someone addressing wounds. He did not begin with rules. He began with the heart. He did not move away from suffering. He walked directly into it. I was struck by how often he stood beside the poor, the rejected, the doubting. He did not demand perfection before offering love. He offered love that made transformation possible. This inverted everything I thought I knew about righteousness. At times I closed the book and paced the room. I felt exposed. I felt seen. I felt both drawn and threatened. The words did not flatter me. They questioned my motives, my pride, my hunger for control. They asked me who I was when no one was watching. Still, I returned, not because I was convinced, but because I was restless without it. What began as reading became listening. What began as critique became attention. I realized something unsettling. I was no longer reading to understand Jesus. I was reading because He seemed to understand me. And that realization frightened me more than disbelief ever had. By day, nothing about me appeared different. I was the dutiful son, the disciplined student, the man others trusted. I spoke the familiar language of responsibility and respect. I fulfilled expectations carefully, almost perfectly. By night, I became someone else, not rebellious but divided. When the world went quiet, the struggle inside me grew louder. I prayed as I always had, yet my prayers felt unfinished. I read the gospel and then hid it again, as if hiding could contain what was happening within me. I lived between two loyalties, each demanding my whole heart. This double life exhausted me, not physically but spiritually. I felt like a man standing with one foot on each shore as the river widened beneath him. Family duty pulled me one way, inner conviction pulled me another. I feared that choosing either fully would mean losing myself. Guilt followed me everywhere. Guilt for questioning, guilt for reading in secret, guilt for imagining a future my family had not chosen for me. I told myself that silence was noble, that concealment was kindness, yet silence began to feel like dishonesty. I asked God to remove the tension. Instead, He deepened it. The more I tried to suppress what I was discovering, the more insistent it became. Faith, I learned, cannot be managed like a schedule. When it calls for everything. There were nights I wished I had never opened the gospel. Ignorance would have been easier. But truth, once glimpsed, does not retreat, it waits. I began to understand that the struggle itself was revealing something important. That obedience without truth hollows the soul. That love without honesty becomes fragile. And that God does not whisper to confuse, but to invite courage. Still, I was afraid. Afraid of disappointing my parents. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of who I would become if I answered the call. I felt growing stronger. I did not yet know that the hardest part was still ahead. The moment did not arrive with thunder. There was no vision, no voice from the sky, no drama worthy of retelling. It came quietly, almost gently, the way truth often does when it knows you are already tired of resisting it. I was alone. I remember that clearly. I had reached a point where arguments no longer protected me. I had read enough. I had prayed enough. I had struggled enough. What remained was not confusion, but fear of the cost. That night I did not pray as I had been taught. I did not recite. I did not reason. I spoke plainly, almost desperately. I told God that I was tired of hiding from him and from myself. I told him that if Jesus was truly the way he claimed to be, then I was willing to follow, even if I did not yet understand where that path would lead. There was no ecstasy, there were no tears at first. There was something deeper, a stillness, a settling. As if a war I had been fighting quietly for years had finally ceased. I did not feel victorious. I felt honest. For the first time in a long while, my prayers did not feel like they were bouncing off the ceiling. They felt received, not judged, not measured, received. I sensed a peace that did not depend on certainty, but on surrender. In that moment, I knew something irreversible had occurred. Not because I felt different emotionally, but because my allegiance had shifted. I could not return to pretending that nothing had changed. I had crossed a line that exists not in geography or culture, but in the soul. I understood immediately that this decision would cost me. Faith gained privately must eventually be lived publicly. Love, if it is real, demands truth, and truth demands courage. I did not feel brave. I felt small. I felt exposed. I felt aware that my life would no longer fit neatly into the expectations placed upon it. Yet beneath the fear, there was clarity. I was no longer divided. That clarity did not remove my love for my family. It intensified it, which is why what followed was the hardest test of my life. Because believing in Jesus was one thing, telling my family was another. After that night, I carried a secret heavier than any burden I had known before. It was not shame, it was love mixed with fear. I loved my parents too much to wound them carelessly. I loved my family too deeply to fracture it with a sentence spoken too quickly. And yet, every day that passed in silence felt like a quiet betrayal, not of them, but of the truth I had embraced. I rehearsed the conversation in my mind countless times. I imagined my mother's face. I imagined my father's silence. I imagined anger, tears, rejection, and worse, disappointment. In our culture, faith is not a private preference. It is loyalty. To change it feels like turning away from one's own blood. So I delayed. I hid. I lived carefully. At home, I prayed as before. I spoke the familiar words. I avoided questions. I told myself I was protecting my family. But protection slowly turned into pressure. Each meal felt heavier. Each shared prayer felt incomplete. I began to understand that concealment, even when motivated by love, slowly corrodes the soul. There were moments I almost spoke. My throat would tighten, my courage would rise, and then fear would silence me again. Fear of causing pain, fear of losing the warmth of belonging, fear of being alone inside my own home. I asked Jesus to take this cup from me. I asked him to let me follow him quietly, invisibly, without consequence. But faith does not grow in hiding forever. Eventually, truth demands daylight. The irony was painful. The faith that had given me peace now denied me rest. I was no longer divided in belief, but I was divided in life. I began to realize that love without truth is not peace. It is postponement. I did not know how the truth would emerge. I only knew that it would. Secrets have a way of surfacing when the heart can no longer carry them alone. And then, one ordinary day, the decision was taken out of my hands. It happened without preparation, without a speech, without the careful words I had practiced in silence. My mother found the New Testament. I still remember the sound of her voice when she called my name. It was not loud. It was not angry. It carried something far heavier than either, confusion mixed with fear, a mother's instinct that something sacred had been disturbed. In that moment, all my strategies collapsed. There was no more delay available to me. No more hiding behind timing or circumstance. The truth, once discovered, does not wait for courage to arrive. We sat together. The room felt smaller than it ever had before. The book lay between us like a fracture made visible. She asked questions slowly, as if hoping each one would undo what her eyes had already seen. I did not rush to explain. I did not argue. I simply told her the truth. I told her that I had not abandoned God. I told her that I had not rejected my upbringing. I told her that I had encountered Jesus and chosen to follow him. She wept, not out of anger, but out of grief. To her, it felt like losing a child who was still sitting in front of her. Her tears were not accusations, they were mourning, and that hurt more than shouting ever could have. When my father learned the truth, he did not raise his voice. He did not confront me immediately. He withdrew. His silence was heavy, disciplined, and devastating. In his eyes, I saw disappointment, not because I had failed morally, but because I had broken continuity. I had stepped outside the story he believed I was meant to carry forward. My siblings reacted differently. Some were confused, some were frightened, some avoided the subject entirely. Our home, once warm with routine and familiarity, grew cold with uncertainty. Meals were quieter, prayers were strained, love was still present, but it no longer flowed freely. I questioned myself relentlessly. Had I been selfish? Had I mistaken emotion for truth? Was faith worth this pain? There were nights I lay awake wondering whether obedience to God required such loss. What no one tells you about moments like these is that conviction does not remove sorrow. You can be certain and still grieve deeply. You can be at peace with God and still feel abandoned by those you love most. I did not defend myself. I did not preach. I did not demand understanding. I simply remained. I stayed present. I accepted the distance without resentment. Love, I learned, sometimes means enduring misunderstanding without explanation. This was the beginning of a long season of emotional exile. Not rejected entirely, but no longer fully embraced. And yet, even there, something unexpected began to grow. The weeks that followed were among the loneliest of my life. Nothing dramatic happened. No doors were slammed. No words of banishment were spoken. And yet, the absence of warmth was unmistakable. Our home functioned, but it no longer breathed. Conversations became careful. Laughter thinned. I felt like a guest in a place that had once been my shelter. I carried a constant sense of guilt, not because I believed I was wrong, but because I could see the pain my honesty had caused. There were moments when shame crept in quietly. Not the shame of sin, but the shame of being different. I wondered whether courage had been arrogance, whether conviction had been cruelty. I replayed my mother's tears again and again, asking myself if truth should ever cost that much. I prayed more than I ever had, but my prayers were no longer confident. They were fractured. I asked God why faith, which promises reconciliation, so often begins with division. I asked him why obedience sometimes feels like abandonment. I did not ask to go back. I asked to endure. During this season, I found myself drawn to a small Christian community. Not because they replaced my family, but because they helped me survive without bitterness. They did not celebrate my pain. They sat with it. They prayed when I had no words left. They reminded me that Christ himself was misunderstood by those closest to him. The scriptures became less theoretical and more necessary. I read not to learn doctrine, but to stay standing. Stories of exile, rejection, and quiet faith took on new meaning. I realized that belief is not proven in moments of agreement, but in seasons of loss. Slowly, something shifted inside me. I stopped trying to convince my family. I stopped defending my choice. I began to focus on loving them well, even when love was not returned in the way I hoped. I learned restraint. I learned patience. I learned that faith expressed through gentleness speaks louder than arguments ever could. And then, in small ways, almost imperceptible at first, the cold began to thaw. My mother began to ask how my studies were going, not as an obligation, but with genuine interest. My younger brother lingered longer in conversation, curiosity flickering behind caution. My father remained distant, but he no longer withdrew completely. Presence, however, restrained, replaced absence. These were not reconciliations, they were openings. And I learned to honor them without rushing. Faith had cost me comfort, but it was giving me something deeper. The ability to love without control, to remain without conditions, to trust that healing, like belief, unfolds in its own time. Suffering did not weaken my faith, it stripped it of illusion. I had believed quietly that once I chose truth, clarity would follow, that obedience would be rewarded quickly. Instead, I entered a season where nothing was resolved and everything was tested. Faith stopped being something I felt and became something I practiced. I learned patience the hard way, not the patience of waiting for results, but the patience of remaining loving when nothing changes. I stopped expecting my family to understand me. I stopped hoping for sudden acceptance. I began to measure faith not by outcomes, but by posture. There were days I wanted to explain myself again, more clearly, more persuasively. I wanted to find the perfect words that would heal the wound instantly. But I realized something important. Explanation can become a form of control. Love, if it is real, allows others to move at their own pace. So I became quiet, not withdrawn, but gentle. I helped where I could. I listened more than I spoke. I respected the boundaries my family needed, even when those boundaries hurt me. This was not weakness. It was discipline of the heart. In prayer, I stopped asking God to change my family. I asked him to change me, to remove resentment before it hardened, to keep my love from becoming conditional, to teach me how to suffer without becoming smaller. Jesus became less of a figure I admired and more of a companion I relied on. I understood his words about loving enemies in a new way. Sometimes, the hardest love is not toward those who hate us, but toward those who love us imperfectly. I also learned humility. I realized that my family's pain was not proof of my righteousness. It was simply pain. They were grieving a future they had imagined for me. Their resistance was not cruelty, it was loss. This understanding softened me. It prevented faith from becoming arrogance. It reminded me that belief is not a weapon to win arguments, but a light to be carried carefully. In this season, I began to see my journey not as a rejection of where I came from, but as a continuation shaped by suffering. Faith, when it matures, learns to hold contradiction without breaking. Love and disagreement, conviction and compassion, truth and patience. Something in me grew quieter but stronger. And in that strength, reconciliation began to approach, slowly, without announcement. Reconciliation does not arrive with declarations. It arrives with gestures so small they are easy to miss. One evening, my mother placed a meal in front of me the way she always had. There was no comment, no tension in her hands, just care. I understood immediately what she was offering. Not agreement, but love. I accepted it without trying to expand the moment beyond what it was. My younger brother began asking questions cautiously at first. Not challenges, not debates, simple questions. Why I seemed calmer, why I read so often, why I no longer reacted with anger when tensions rose. I answered him honestly but briefly. Curiosity, I learned, must be met with humility, not persuasion. My father took the longest. His pain ran deeper, shaped by responsibility and legacy. But one day, as we walked together in silence, he spoke. He did not mention faith. He spoke of family, of duty, of the bond between a father and a son. And then he said something that stayed with me. He told me that disagreement does not erase blood, that disappointment does not end love, that while he did not understand my choice, I was still his son. Nothing had changed that. That moment did not resolve everything. We did not suddenly speak openly about belief. The tension did not vanish, but something essential was restored. Unconditional presence. I realized then that reconciliation is not the erasure of difference. It is the refusal to let difference destroy relationship. Faith had cost me intimacy, but it had also taught me how to wait for it without demanding it. This experience reshaped how I understood leadership. A leader cannot demand unity by force. True unity is built by patience, by respect, by allowing others dignity, even when they disagree. Reconciliation, whether in a family or a nation, follows the same law. I carried this lesson with me into every space of responsibility that followed. Into conversations about conflict, into decisions about power, into moments where restraint mattered more than strength. My faith did not give me superiority, it gave me endurance. And with endurance came a new sense of calling, larger than my personal story. Out of that endurance, a mission began to form quietly within me. Not a mission to convert, not a mission to argue, but a mission to stand in the space between worlds without hardening my heart. I realized that my story was no longer only mine. It carried echoes of countless others across Africa and beyond who live between faiths, between generations, between loyalty and conviction. People who love their families deeply and yet feel called to walk a path that those families did not choose. I did not feel chosen. I felt entrusted. My journey taught me that faith, when it is real, does not demand applause. It demands responsibility. It asks us to become bridges where walls would be easier, to listen where shouting would feel more powerful, to carry hope without humiliating those who do not yet see it. As my public life expanded and responsibility grew heavier, this inner calling remained steady. I knew what it meant to be misunderstood. I knew what it meant to be judged without explanation. That knowledge changed how I viewed conflict, especially in the Sahel, where religion, identity, and power are often weaponized. I learned that peace cannot be imposed by force alone. It must be nurtured by moral courage. And moral courage begins in the private life, long before it appears on a public stage. I also learned to speak carefully about faith, not to dilute it, but to honor its weight. I never forgot the pain my honesty had caused. That memory kept me from arrogance. It reminded me that truth spoken without love becomes another form of violence. In prayer, I began to ask Jesus not for success, but for faithfulness, for Burkina Faso, for Africa, for myself. I asked for the strength to lead without hatred, to resist corruption without losing compassion, to confront injustice without becoming consumed by it. I asked him to bless my country with leaders who fear God more than they fear losing power. I asked him to heal a continent scarred by exploitation, division, and despair. And I asked him to keep my own heart from growing cold under the weight of responsibility. My faith did not remove doubt from the world. It gave me the courage to live honestly within it. It taught me that leadership without moral grounding is dangerous, and belief without humility is empty. This is why I share my story now, not to persuade, but to witness, not to elevate myself, but to remind others that even leaders are first human beings, called to choose integrity again and again. And that choice never ends. There are mornings when I wake before dawn, before the noise of the world remembers me. In those moments, I am not a president. I am not a symbol. I am simply a man standing again before God, aware of how easily power can hollow the soul if it is not anchored in something greater than ambition. I look at Burkina Faso, at Africa, at a world that knows how to build weapons faster than it learns how to heal hearts. I see leaders exhausted by conflict and citizens worn down by promises that never arrive. I see religion used as a banner for division instead of a call to conscience. And I know, with painful clarity, that none of this will change unless those who lead are willing to be judged inwardly before they judge outwardly. My journey of faith did not make me morally superior, it made me morally accountable. Following Jesus did not remove temptation, fear, or doubt, it placed them in the light. It reminded me that leadership is not first about commanding others, but about governing oneself. To my Muslim brothers and sisters, I speak with respect and gratitude. Islam shaped my discipline, my sense of duty, my reverence for God. I have not forgotten where I come from. Faith traditions are not erased by honesty. They are honored when we refuse to weaponize them. To my Christian brothers and sisters, I speak with humility. Faith is not proven by how loudly we declare it, but by how gently we carry it. If belief does not produce compassion, restraint, and courage, it produces nothing worth defending. To the leaders of the Sahel, and to leaders everywhere, I say this quietly but firmly. Power without moral grounding becomes predatory. Strategy without conscience becomes cruelty. A nation can survive poverty longer than it can survive leaders who have forgotten how to listen to God and to their own people. Africa does not need perfect leaders, it needs honest ones. Leaders who know what it means to be wrong, who have paid a personal cost for truth, who understand that reconciliation is slower than revenge but stronger. I ask Jesus for blessing, not as a political tool, but as a moral plea. Bless Burkina Faso with wisdom greater than anger. Bless Africa with leaders who fear God more than they fear losing control. Bless me with the courage to repent when I am wrong, to forgive when I am wounded, and to step aside when my pride grows louder than my conscience. I also ask for blessing upon a world that feels tired of itself, a world that scrolls past suffering but cannot escape it, a world hungry for meaning but suspicious of faith. May we remember that belief, at its best, does not close minds, it opens hearts. If you are listening to this and carrying your own quiet struggle, know this. Faith is not a shortcut out of pain, it is a way through it. Honesty will cost you something, love will wound you, truth will isolate you at times, but none of these are wasted when they are carried with humility. I do not ask you to agree with me. I ask you to examine yourself, to ask what anchors your decisions when no one is watching, to consider whether the world needs more certainty or more conscience. If this reflection resonates with you, I invite you to share your thoughts, not to argue but to listen to one another. And if you wish to continue this journey of reflection, stay with me and walk slowly. These conversations are not meant to be rushed. Every day I wake up and must choose again. There is no final victory, only vigilance or surrender. I want to end where every honest journey must end, not with certainty but with responsibility. I have shared this story not because it is comfortable, and not because it presents me in a heroic light. I have shared it because the world is aching for leaders who are willing to speak from the place where fear, doubt, and conscience meet. Africa has seen too many strong men who were weak inside, and too many speeches that sounded confident but were empty of truth. My life has taught me that faith is not an escape from reality, it is an entrance into it. It strips away excuses, it exposes pride, it asks questions that power prefers to avoid, and it demands that leaders remember they will one day answer to something higher than history books or public opinion. I pray for Burkina Faso, not only for security or prosperity, but for moral clarity. I pray that our people will never be reduced to instruments of ideology or collateral in someone else's ambition. I pray that our children will inherit not only land, but dignity, not only borders, but meaning. I pray for Africa, a continent rich in spirit and wounded by exploitation. May we stop borrowing our values from those who profit from our division. May our leaders learn that authority is not proven by force, but by restraint. May we choose reconciliation over revenge, justice over spectacle, and truth over convenience. I pray also for the world beyond Africa, a world that has learned how to dominate but forgotten how to repent, a world that debates morality endlessly, yet trembles at the thought of accountability. May we remember that progress without conscience is just another form of decay. To my fellow leaders, I say this without accusation. Place God before power, not in slogans, not in ceremonies, but in decisions. Think of the faces you will never meet who will live with the consequences of what you sign, what you approve, what you ignore. Leadership that forgets the human cost becomes tyranny, even when it uses polite language. To those listening who are not leaders but feel the weight of this age, know this: you are not insignificant. Your honesty matters. Your refusal to hate matters. Your quiet choice to do good when no one rewards you matters. History is often changed not by those who shout, but by those who refuse to surrender their conscience. My journey of faith cost me certainty, comfort, and approval. It gave me something far more demanding: accountability, humility, and the courage to live without pretending that power can save what only truth can heal. If you carry doubts, do not bury them in fear. If you carry faith, do not weaponize it. If you carry authority, do not confuse it with righteousness. And if you carry wounds, do not believe they disqualify you from purpose. Often, they are what prepare you for it. I do not claim to have arrived. I claim only to remain awake. If these words have stirred something in you, I invite you to reflect, to respond thoughtfully, and to continue this conversation with sincerity rather than certainty. And if you wish to walk further into these questions of faith, leadership, and conscience, stay with me. Because every morning, without exception, I wake up and must choose again. There is no final victory, only vigilance or surrender.